All the slaves were sold, only one was left behind, and only a human bought the worthless. They burned the last body at dawn. Ash drifted like phantom snow, mingling with the real thing, smearing across the battered windows of the colony's hangars. No one wept, no one stayed to watch on this moon. Death wasn't sacred. It was routine disposal. One less mouth to feed, one less breath to waste oxygen. Herman Vale kept walking. The cold clung to him, wrapping around his coat like a second skin, ice crunched. Under his boots, fine and sharp as bone dust above him, floodlights hummed, flickering in stubborn protest against the endless polar night. The colony was half dead, stitched together by patched cables, whining reactors, and people too poor, too guilty. To leave, he wasn't here for the auction. He told himself that 3 times before the hangar came into view. The old shuttle bay had been converted into a makeshift market. Welded cages, heat lamps, guard drones, humming along rusted ceiling tracks. The bidding had ended hours ago. Only shadows remained pacing in the distance, like carry-on crows that had already feasted. Herman stepped through the outer arch. A rush of recycled air hit his face, reeking faintly of hot plastic and cold fear. All the cages were empty or so. He thought then he saw her at the far end, half shrouded in frost, and silence sat, a figure the others had left behind. She was motionless, knees drawn to her chest, arms limp at her sides, hair spilling like fire across her back, long deep crimson strands like blood frozen mid-fall. Her skin was not human, a faint gleam of sapphire gray, too smooth, too still. She didn't flinch at his approach, didn't track him, didn't move at all. Herman frowned. He wasn't a rescuer. He wasn't kind. Not anymore, but something about the shape of her, the stillness that wasn't sleep, the silence that wasn't peace, held him there. He crouched beside the cage. The metal was rimmed with frost. "They forget you?" he asked softly. No answer up close. She looked almost sculpted, as if someone had carved her from a single piece of tinted ice and left her to melt. Her face was angled away, eyes closed. She might have been dead if not for the steady condensation on the cage's inner wall near her mouth. Alive barely, he reached through the bars. Slow, careful, his fingers brushed hers. Ice cold. No reaction. Then barely perceptible, a twitch. Her fingers flexed once, like a reflex, like something inside. Her wanted to recoil, but didn't have the strength. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was weight, like being stared at by a god who'd long since stopped caring. "She's not for sale anymore," a voice called out behind him. Gruff, bored Herman stood, turning toward the 2 auction handlers. One wore a cracked rebreather. Around his throat, the other was chewing a stimstick like it owed him money. She was part of the lineup. Herman asked, nodding toward the cage. Was the first man said, "Didn't move, didn't speak, waste of oxygen. No bids." "What is she?" he asked. "Human hybrid." The second man spat into the corner. "Nah, some temple breed from the Spiral Reach. Thought she was too good to speak, might be brain damage, don't matter now." The first handler shrugged. "If you want her, take her, no credits needed, just sign and walk. We were going to dump her in the bow waste anyway." Herman didn't speak. He looked back at her long red hair draped across blue-gray shoulders, unmoving, unshivering, not resisting, not hoping him over to the nearby kiosk. The biometric scanner flared to life under his palm. The transfer file popped up with a single line, unclaimed unit marked unsuitable for labor or trade. He signed. Anyway, a minute later, the cage opened with a dry hiss. Cold air rolled out. Herman stepped in. He didn't speak, just slipped off his coat and wrapped it around her with slow, deliberate care. Her body was light too, light, malnourished, limpio as he lifted her into his arms. Her eyes fluttered, not open, not awake, but something inside flickered like heat, trying to return to a long dead ember. The traitors laughed behind him. "You'll regret that, stranger. Broken ones don't come back." He didn't answer outside. The wind had picked up snow, sliced sideways across the path. Fine and stinging, his breath came in heavy clouds. He adjusted, his grip on her, tucking her closer against his chest. She didn't resist, didn't react, but her fingers curled faintly against his shirt. His cabin was, up the ridge past the graveyard of fallen comm towers and half-collapsed supply tunnels, a single structure, clinging. To the cliff fed by an old thermal bore, he walked without pause, boots finding familiar grooves in the stone. The storm howled as if trying to tear the moon in half. Inside the cabin, heat greeted them like a whispered apology. The panel still worked. Barely he carried her to the hearth and laid her gently on the thermal bench. Then he knelt beside her, his hands already moving, removing the torn remains of her garment, wrapping her in a thermal blanket. Checking her breathing, her skin was colder than it should have been. Her pulse, shallow but steady. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why he'd done this. He only knew that when he saw her left behind after everyone else had been claimed, bartered, branded, something inside him refused to. Walk away, he prepared broth. Nothing fancy, synth chicken and saline heated until it steamed. He brought it to her lips. She didn't move, so he touched the rim to her mouth. A drop landed on her lips. She twitched, a flicker passed across her face. Something close to confusion then. She opened her mouth, she drank in trembling, halting sips too fast. She choked. He steadied her. Waited. Let her try again. When she finished, her eyes stayed closed. But her body eased by a fraction. A muscle in her jaw unclenched, a single tear rolled down her cheek and froze there. Herman sat back, watching the steam rise from the empty cup. He didn't speak again. But in that quiet room with the snowstorm scratching at the walls like a forgotten god, something had changed. She wasn't gone, and he hadn't been alone. Not anymore. The cabin smelled of heated stone and thawed fabric, like the moment after a blizzard when breath becomes visible again, not from fear, but from relief. Herman closed the door against the storm's howl and stood motionless for a second, listening to the world adjust his boots. Dripped melted snow onto the floor, steaming faintly in the soft warmth of the hearth. The girl lay where he'd left her, wrapped in thermal layers framed by the yellow light of the Lowe's slung lamp, still as a sculpture. Her long red hair spilled over the side of the bench ends, damp with melting frost. She hadn't shifted, hadn't made a sound, but something had changed. He didn't know what yet, only that the silence no longer felt empty. Herman set down the teacup she'd sipped from No Clean, placed neatly on the cabin's shelf. Not by him, her hands had moved quietly. Without asking, that alone meant more than a dozen conversations. He stepped over to the heating core, adjusted the dial a notch higher. A gentle whir started up, and warm air poured through floor vents like a sigh. The faint sound of thermal expansion metal clicking against its own memory echoed in the background. Outside, the wind had softened, though snow rattled against the outer walls, like someone knocking to be let in. She didn't turn toward the sound. She didn't track him, but her breathing was different now. Deeper, slower, less like survival, more like rest. He watched her for a moment longer, then crossed to the water tank in the kitchenette. The generator's hum surged as he heated water again. Slightly warmer this time, he poured it into a basin and returned to her side with a cloth in hand. She didn't resist as he gently touched her forehead with the damp fabric. She didn't flinch, but her fingers twitched beneath the blanket, reacting to the sudden contrast of warmth on her chilled skin. Just cleaning up the frost, he murmured. No harm meant still no words. He moved, carefully wiped her cheeks. The fine edges of her jaw, the delicate line behind her ear. Her skin was cold, but not dangerously so anymore. No signs of frostbite, just bruises that hadn't faded, yet along her collarbone under one wrist. Not fresh, not healed when he reached for her hand. She tensed. He paused. Not afraid, not pulling away, just uncertain, as if her body had learned to anticipate pain from even the softest contact. He laid the cloth aside and just held her hand between his, let her feel the difference. No pressure, no demand, just touch. Human and steady. Minutes passed. Then, with a whisper of motion, her fingers settled, loosened her palm, rested lightly in his, still cool but no longer resisting. Herman exhaled, the breath left him in a slow, uneven sigh he hadn't realized. He was holding it. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. I don't know if you understand my language, but maybe you can feel it. She gave no reply, but he thought, maybe. Her head tilted half a degree toward his voice. He released her hand gently, and rose, stretching his spine, until it cracked. Outside wind slapped against the cabin once more, reminding him the solar relays would ice over again if he didn't clear them soon. He couldn't afford a blackout. Not now, got to check the panels, he said aloud, mostly for her benefit. Only takes 15 minutes, give or take. You're safe here, door. Locks heat steady. No answer. Not even a glance. Still, when he stepped toward the entrance, her finger shifted again. A fractional movement, a tug at the edge of the blanket. She wasn't asleep, but she was aware that mattered. He geared up thick, coat face wrap insulated gloves and stepped out into the pale light of early evening. Serried sky was the color of iron, low and churning, lit faintly by the glow of a distant gas giant that hung like a dull lantern. Beyond the clouds, the snow wasn't falling. Now it just hovered, suspended in bitter wind currents that hissed between cliffs. The panels were half buried again. He cleared them quickly. Mechanical motions drilled into his muscles. From months of repetition, the rig hissed and shuddered as the frost came free. He adjusted the intake filter, checked the charge. Then he paused, hands still resting on the solar frame, and let the wind press against him. Why had he brought her here? He wasn't a good man. Not anymore. Not since the accident. Not since the fire. Everyone back home had called it a tragic loss, a senseless malfunction. But the part he never spoke of, the part that still woke him at night, was that he'd been there when it happened, and he'd run. He hadn't saved anyone until now. Maybe this was a second chance, or maybe it was just desperation. He shook the thought away and headed back down the path, boots sinking into the powder with satisfying weight. The cabin was warm when he returned. The lamp still glowed low, vescent of heated fabric oil, stone, and citrus tea lingered in the air. She hadn't moved, but the blanket had shifted slightly, as if she'd curled a little tighter. Not in fear, but for comfort. And the cup on the shelf, still clean still. There but her hands now rested, palm up atop the blanket, inviting. He removed. His coat shook off the snow and crouched beside her again. Back, he said softly. Voice calm, didn't take long. No reply then. So faint he thought he'd imagined it. She exhaled not just breath, but release of tension uncoiling. He stayed there in the quiet, letting her adjust. Letting himself adjust too. And then as he reached to adjust the lamp's dimmer, she spoke one word. Why he froze. Her voice was barely audible, soft, foreign in its structure, shaped like breath catching on wind, but unmistakably clear, deliberate. He turned back to her slowly. Her eyes were open, white and blue both clouded. Not blind, but distant. Focused not on him, but the space he occupied. She didn't repeat the question. She didn't need to. He sat beside her on the floor and rested his elbows on his knees. I saw you, everyone else. They were claimed, bought. Taken a pause, you were left like trash. She said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers shifted again. He continued, maybe I don't know why. Maybe I just couldn't stand the silence that earned him the faintest crease between her brows, almost skepticism, or maybe understanding. She blinked slowly, then her eyes closed again, and this time she slept. Not unconscious, not collapsed from hunger or cold. She chose to rest, and Herman stayed exactly where he was, watching her chest rise and fall until the heater kicked on again with a soft exhale and the cabin sighed with her. The wind had died overnight. It wasn't the usual storm-stilled silence either, the kind that hinted at worse to come. This quiet was different, softer, waiting. Herman sat near the hearth, knees pulled to his chest, arms resting loosely across them. The heat from the old furnace had finally penetrated the bones of the cabin. He could feel it in his hands again, in the small of his back, in his breath across from him. Soraya still slept. Not the strange, shallow breathing of a body conserving energy, but the deeper rhythm of rest. Her chest rose and fell in time with the subtle hum of the cabin's walls. She hadn't cried out, hadn't flinched in the night. She had simply remained. He didn't disturb her. He sat and listened to the space around her, its tension slowly unraveling when she stirred. It wasn't sudden. Her fingers moved first, curling faintly around the edge of the blanket. Then her eyes blinked open white and moonlit, glassy but alert. She scanned the room, not with direct sight, but in layers, listening with her skin testing the air. He waited, giving her that first breath without pressure. Eventually she sat up. The blanket fell from her shoulders, pooling. In her lap, "Good morning," he offered, gently. Her gaze didn't land directly on him, but somewhere near his voice. "I thought I died," she said. "You didn't," he replied. "You're here." A beat passed, then another. "Why do you live in a place like this?" The question hung in the air, not accusation but genuine confusion. Herman stood and walked to the small stove. He poured warm tea into 2 metal cups. "I used to live in a place with noise-color crowds," he said. "Then I lost people. And after that, I lost my way. So I came here somewhere. No one would ask me what I used to be." He handed her a cup. She took it with both hands, holding it just below her face as if absorbing the steam more than the liquid does. "It work?" she asked quietly. Some days she sipped slowly, carefully. The silence between them softened after a few minutes. Saraya stood. Herman tensed instinctively but didn't move. He just watched. She walked the length of the room without speaking. Her steps, soundless, deliberate, her fingers traced the walls, the worn table, the carved bench. She paused near the shelf where his older sculptures rested, half-formed or long-finished. She reached out and brushed the edge of one, a warped cube abstract, shaped more by grief than by skill. Her brow creased. "This one hums wrong." He smiled, faintly. "That was the first thing I tried to carve after the fire. I think it's a little broken." "No," she said. "Not broken. Just unfinished." She turned toward him, her hair glowing ember red in the firelight. "Like you." He opened his mouth, then closed. She continued exploring, this time near the storage door. There she found his emergency pack, a weatherproof satchel with essential tools, ration bars, medical foam, and 2 backup energy cells. She ran a hand along the zipper and glanced toward him. "You were ready to leave?" "No," he said. "I was ready to survive." She nodded, then did something he hadn't expected. She knelt on the floor beside the satchel, opened it slowly, and removed 1 ration bar she peeled. It broke it in half and held out a piece to him. He took it. They sat cross-legged on the floor and ate in silence. The taste wasn't good, but it was warm, and it filled the hollow space inside them with something that wasn't fear. "I don't remember the last time I ate with someone," she said. "Me either." She paused. Her voice dropped smaller now. "My kind. We don't eat in front of those we don't trust. The mouth is sacred." Exposed. He blinked, and yet here we are. She gave a breath of laughter. It wasn't full or free, but it was real. "You said you lost people. Who were they?" He stared into the flames. 3 apprentices. Young, talented, better than I was. Probably I was supposed to be teaching them, but the studio caught fire. Electrical fault. I got out. They didn't. Her eyes didn't flinch. "You tried?" He nodded. "The beam collapsed by the time I got back with help. The whole gallery was gone, and you blamed yourself every day." They sat quietly again. Then Saraya spoke, voice like smoke. "I once carved a memory stone for a mother who'd lost her mate. She asked me to trap his last words in the spiral. Did it work? I don't know." She said it did. But I couldn't hear them myself, only feel the grief vibrating through the stone. He met her gaze. "Can you still do that?" he asked. "Sometimes, but I haven't tried since the sedation. I'm not the same. No one ever is after pain," he said. "But maybe that's what gives us shape." She tilted her head like stone. "Exactly." That night, they didn't sit across the room from one another. They worked side by side on a fresh piece, simple clay. This time Sarah pressed her hands into it. First Herman guided from behind, showing her how to pinch and pull tension lines, how to shape without breaking their hands. Touched more than once, neither flinched by the end of the night. The clay held the first echo of something new, a curve, a gesture of form. Neither could name yet, but one that had weight when they lay down to sleep. Sarah didn't curl away. She faced him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel, the space shrinking between them. And for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like a beginning. The mornings came slower now. Not because of the cold, it was just as merciless, but because neither of them rushed anymore. There was a rhythm forming between them, not in words, but in movement, in shared heat, in the way they carved time into something tangible. Sura awoke before. Herman she'd begun rising early, stepping barefoot onto the heated floor panels and slipping into the workspace before the first tea boiled. She never said why. Maybe she didn't. Know herself today was the same. The grey-blue light of Sarade's thin sky filtered through frost-laced glass as she crouched in the sculpture room, staring down at a lump of stone that refused to speak. Her hands hovered above it, trembling faintly, as if trying to read something written deep within. She reached for a chisel. Her grip was unsteady. Herman's voice came from behind, her warm but tentative. "Starting something new?" "No," she said. Trying to finish something old, she didn't turn, just pressed the tip of the chisel to the stone's edge and paused. The tool shook in her hand. He crossed the room, slowly crouching nearby, without invading the space between them. "Do you want help?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I want to feel what I used to." Her hand moved, the chisel struck too hard, the stone split not cleanly, not elegantly. A ragged crack snaked across the surface, fracturing the shape before it could form. Sarah froze. Herman waited. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then abruptly, she stood and hurled the tool across the room. It struck the far wall with a clatter that echoed like a scream. "I can't do it," she whispered. Herman stood Sarah. "I can't do it," she said again, louder. "This time I hear nothing. I feel nothing. It's all hollow." She backed away from the ruined stone, shoulders heaving. "Do you know what they took from me? I wasn't just trained to shape stone. I was the stone the temple heard through me, and now there's only silence." He didn't try to speak. "Not yet. I carve for the dead," she said, her voice cracking, "for the wounded, for those who couldn't carry their grief anymore, and now I can't even make a line without shattering it." Her knees gave out. She sank to the floor, arms wrapped tight around herself. "Herman?" Crossed the room and sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just waited until her breath slowed, until the trembling passed, until her silence softened from panic into weariness. Then he said gently, "I didn't touch stone for 5 years." She looked at him. "I tried once," he continued, "the week after the fire. My hand slipped. I cut straight through the sculpture's core. After that I packed up every chisel, every file, every scrap of clay." Why, she asked. "Because I thought creation should come from peace. And I didn't have any. And now I know it doesn't. It comes from pain, from memory, from choosing to shape it anyway." Sarah stared at the cracked stone in front of her. "I want to believe that," she said. "You don't have to just start with trying again." A long silence passed. Then she shifted closer to him, leaned slightly, not into him, but toward him, as if the gravity had changed. "I feel ashamed," she whispered. "So did I. I feel broken. I know, and you're still here." He nodded. "Because broken, things don't stay that way. Not if they're held." Her eyes shimmered, not from tears, but from something deeper, resonance, recognition. Slowly she turned toward him and laid her forehead gently against his shoulder. He let her. They sat there until the fire dimmed and the wind picked up again. Outside later that evening, Sarah stood before the same slab she'd broken. She hadn't thrown it out. She'd placed it upright again, gently, like a wounded limb reset in its socket. Herman watched from the workbench, sipping bitter tea. She picked up a smaller chisel. Not the heavy one from before, this one fit more naturally. In her grip, she pressed its edge to the fracture line and began tracing it. Not to erase, but to follow. He rose and stepped beside her. "Want to carve it together?" he asked. She didn't answer with words. She simply moved slightly to the left and made space for him beside her. They worked in silence, chisels moving in sync, each echoing the others. Motion. The crack became a line. The line became a curve. The curve became something beautiful, not because it was smooth, but because it told the truth later as they sat by the fire. Herman asked, "What was your name before you were taken?" She shook her head. "We didn't have names the way you do. We were roles. Echoes of the ones before and now." She turned to him, eyes bright in the flickering light. "Now I am Soraya because you asked." His chest ached at the quiet gravity of that sentence. He reached out and touched her hand gently. Not to lead, not to take, but to stay. And this time she laced her fingers through his. Without hesitation, the moon was too still outside. The snow had stopped, falling. No wind whispered against the window panes. No creaks came from the mountain shelf that held their cabin, like a stone in a giant's palm. Even the furnace seemed to hum more quietly, as if the air itself had learned to hold its breath. Soraya noticed it first. She sat, cross-legged beside the finished sculpture, one hand pressed gently against its surface, eyes closed. Not listening with her ears, but with her whole body. She turned toward Herman without speaking. He froze, reading the tightness in her shoulders, the strain just beneath her breath. "Someone's out there," she whispered. He didn't ask how. She knew he trusted her now, just as she'd begun to trust him. He stood quickly, quietly pulling his coat down from the peg near the door. The rifle, an old solar-charged bolt model, hung beside it. He hadn't touched it in weeks. He strapped it over his shoulder. "You're staying inside," he said. Sura rose, eyes steady. "I won't hide." "You're not hiding. You're surviving. I didn't come back to life to be shelved again." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once, and handed her the signal wand from his belt, a carved wooden handle with a resonance crystal tip. She could amplify sound with it, if needed, not as a weapon, but a warning if it gets bad. He said, "You make the mountain scream." She nodded, lips pressed in a line of cold resolve. He opened the outer hatch. The air was thinner than it had been, cracked and sharp like it had been carved out of glass down the slope. 3 figures approached, not fast, not stealthy, deliberate. First he recognized the man from before, scarred cheek and crooked smile. This time he wasn't alone. 2 others flanked him, one broad-shouldered and armored, the other with long tools strapped to her back. Not soldiers, freelancers, extractors. Herman stepped out, boots crunching through the crust of ice. The rifle remained slung across his back. "You made a mistake," the scarred man called out. "Should have handed her over when you had the chance. She's not yours to take. She was purchased property. She's a person." Herman said louder now, "And she's under my protection." The extractor woman chuckled. "You think that means something way out here? I think it means enough. Step aside." The large one growled. "We've got a buyer waiting, high-tier collector, rare resonant. Sensitive specimens go for a fortune now. You don't even know what she is, don't need to." She hums. "That's all they care about." Behind him, a low vibration shook the ground, subtle but growing. They all felt it. Sura stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the wand, her face a mask of calm fury around her. The snow shifted not from wind, but from sound. The stones beneath the cabin moaned with old memory. "She's doing that!" The woman hissed. "Yes," Herman said, "and you should leave before she decides to do more." But the man didn't flinch. He stepped forward. "You really think I'm afraid of a broken temple rat and a washed-up sculptor?" Herman's finger twitched toward his rifle strap. But then Soraya stepped forward, 2 barefoot on the snowskin glowing faintly. In the low light, her voice was quiet, but every syllable landed like a dropstone. "I'm not broken." She raised the wand and tapped it against the snow. The mountain answered, not with violence, not with collapse, but with warning. The ridge above them groaned. Snow-loosened rocks trembled in place. I carved death songs. Once she said, "I know how to make a mountain mourn." The wind returned howling, around the bluff like it had just remembered its voice. The three strangers froze head, jerking toward the sound. "Above you don't want to see what happens when I grieve." The first man sneered, but his hand was trembling now. His confidence had cracked. "Fine," he spat. "Keep your pet, she's more trouble than she's worth." He turned boots, grinding into the slope, and the others followed. They didn't run, but they didn't look back either. Soraya stood still until the last echo of their steps vanished. Only then did she lower when her knees buckled. Herman was beside her in an instant, catching her before she hit the ice. Her skin was ice cold. Her breath ragged. "You were trembling," he whispered. "So were they," she replied, faintly smiling. He carried her inside, not because she was weak, but because she'd used every last ember of strength to become more than what they tried to reduce her to. He laid her near the fire, wrapped in thick blankets. She didn't speak, her eyes closed, but her fingers reached out, finding his. She didn't let go. Neither did he. The storm had passed again, but the cold lingered. It seeped through the walls and into the cracks of the stone floor outside. The wind rested, but the snow spoke in sighs as it shifted against the cabin seams inside the heath-eld. Barely Herman stirred the coals. In the hearth, the iron rod clicking against stone. The fire was smaller than usual. Rations for wood had thinned since the last power surge disabled the solar heating cycle. He hadn't told Soraya yet the wood when the sun returned, when the timing didn't feel like defeat. She sat across from him, legs tucked beneath a thick wool blanket. Her eyes fixed not on the fire, but on the half-carved stone block between them. The sculpture had no shape, yet only suggestion. A curl of motion in the center. A slow rise of contrast on one side. It looked like breath arrested halfway. She reached out and touched the edge. Her hand was steady but slow, listening, reading what hadn't been written. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, factual. "You haven't carved since they came." He didn't answer at first, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure how to say it. "They came for what I protect," he said. "That changes the way my hands feel." She nodded once, fingertips still on stone. "I understand." Silence stretched between them, not the brittle kind, but the thick one, the kind full of unspoken things. "I was afraid," she said. He looked up. Her face was tilted slightly toward the fire now, eyes catching flecks of gold. "Not of them," she continued, "of what I'd become. Of using that sound again. You stopped them, but I used what I was trained for as a weapon. A temple listener should never turn resonance into harm. You didn't harm," he said. "You warned her." Eyes flicked to his. For once they held. "I still feel it," she whispered. "The power of it, like heat, I can't put down." He reached across the floor and laid his hand beside hers. "Not touching, but close fire is not evil," he said. "It only burns when it's not contained, but it also warms it, lights it, shapes." She looked at him. The room felt smaller. Not in space, but in distance outside. The snow pressed against the walls. Inside, the fire cracked softly. The light flickered over them, tracing lines of fatigue and tension that hadn't yet eased. Sura moved. Her hand slightly. Her fingers brushed his, not accidental, not urgent, just there. His breath slowed. She turned her palm to meet his. Their hands aligned, skin against skin. Not laced. Nothing, just parallel, like two halves of a thing that finally understood where it belonged. "I haven't slept," she said. "You haven't rested." She gave a breath of agreement, then looked down at their hands. "I don't know how to fall asleep when I'm not afraid. You could try beside me." She didn't move for a moment. Then she stood silently and crossed to the cot. She sat first, waited. He followed. They lay side by side, fully clothed. Bodies, a respectful space apart at first. Then the fire dipped lower and she shifted closer, just enough that her forehead brushed his shoulder. Her hand found his beneath the blanket. Her leg half bent rested lightly against his thigh. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stayed, and she exhaled slow and uneven a sigh. She hadn't let go of in years. Her voice broke the silence fragile. "If I sleep now, will you still be here when I wake?" He turned his head, forehead against hers. "Yes, nothing more." He closed his eyes, and so did she, not because she trusted the world, but because for once she trusted him. And in that cabin, buried in snow, in silence, two scarred people finally rested, not in separate corners, not as guest and host, but as something unnamed, and becoming the fire smoldered low and warm and for. The first time Soraya dreamed without chains, the moon was quiet again. The snow had drifted high overnight, swallowing the lower half of the cabin walls. Cold pressed in from every seam, not violent, but insistent. Herman stirred the fire, carefully stacking the last of their dry wood sparks lifted like breath from the stone. Soraya stood by the door, still listening. "I can't feel them anymore," she said. Her voice was low but certain. He glanced up. "You're sure?" She nodded once. "They're gone." The scavengers hadn't returned. No footprints, no resonance, only clean silence, the kind that followed endings. Still, they'd prepared the sculpture by the door. Originally a symbol, was now a barrier, reinforced, anchored. She'd shaped its lower curve to catch pressure from the outside. He'd weighted it with steel cores and layered stone, a monument and a defense. Herman exhaled slowly, rubbed the tension from his neck, then crossed to the side window outside. Light crept slowly across the snowfields, casting long shadows over the frozen ridge. The sun never truly rose on this moon, but it stretched low like a dying candle and gave just enough warmth to remind you it was there. He turned back to find Soraya watching him, not studying, not waiting, just present. He met her gaze, then crossed to the table. Their tools lay where they'd left them, chisels, carving rods. Resonance picks, the clay-bound heart of their next piece still wrapped in cloth. Soraya followed him. She pulled out the cloth. Inside, the beginnings of a new sculpture, waited no clear form, yet just suggestion, motion, a spiral caught mid-turn, anchored by two figures leaning together in tension, not finished, but alive. She pressed her hand to its surface and winced. Herman noticed pain. She hesitated, then nodded. Some of the nerves never healed. He took her hand in both of his. Her fingers were cold skin, pale. "We can stop." "No," she said. "I don't want to stop. I just want to shift." She moved to the opposite side of the slab, adjusted the angle of the chisel, and let him guide the stone with her, not leading, not teaching, just moving in rhythm. The sound of shaping filled the cabin again. Not the violence of construction, not the violence of collapse, just creation, measured, focused. Soraya worked longer than she usually did, her movement slower. Now grounded when she paused, she wiped her hands against her coat and stepped to the window outside. The snow was clean, no scars, no tracks. She opened the hatch just slightly. The cold rushed in, but not like before, not slicing, just real. She stepped onto the porch. Herman joined her, wrapping a thermal blanket around her shoulders. Before stepping out himself, they stood in the silence together. Shoulder to shoulder below them, the world looked untouched, but they knew better. Buried under that ice were echoes, battles, not fought with blood, but with choice. She leaned her head against his arm. "I was going to die here," she said. "I was ready." He didn't interrupt. "But you didn't let me stay forgotten. You didn't let yourself," he said. She looked up at him. Her breath curled in the air between them. "Would you ever go back?" she asked to Earth. She nodded. He thought for a moment. "I don't think it's home anymore," he said. "I think it stopped being that a long time ago." And now he turned to her fully. "Now it's wherever you are." She held his gaze, then silently, she leaned up and kissed him. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with certainty. When they parted, neither of them looked away. Inside, the fire had dipped low again. Soraya stepped back toward the cabin and looked over her shoulder. "I want to finish the piece," she said, "then build something new." He followed her inside. They worked side by side until the light dimmed again. The final sculpture took shape by the door. A pair of broken forms interlocked, one curved like a flame, the other like a wave, different but fused by weight and intent. It stood in silence, but it said everything. And as the next storm curled low over the horizon, Herman and Sura didn't reach for weapons, they reached for each other. Warmth held, the fire rose again, and the snow outside fell without fear they had built. Something the wind couldn't erase, something that still stood. The sun wasn't truly out, but the light was stronger today, thin and golden, sliding across the snow in long honey-colored ribbons. The wind had taken the day off. The sky above the cliffs looked glassy and wide, its pale shimmer unbroken for once. The world seemed to breathe without tension. Herman stepped outside, hands dusted with dry clay, a smear of white across his forearm. He squinted against the brightness and lifted his face, letting the cold kiss his skin. The air didn't bite like it used to. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was her. The door behind him creaked open. Saria stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself. Her long red hair tied loosely back, wisps catching in the sunlight. Like lit threads, she blinked at the brightness and gave a quiet hum of surprise. The sound was soft, barely more than a vibration. But Herman heard it, felt it in his chest. "It's beautiful," she said. He turned toward her, lips tilting. "I was starting to think you'd never say that word. I've thought it many times, but this time it's out loud." She met his eyes. "This time it's for you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what they'd been through, of everything they hadn't said, because they didn't need to. He reached out, and she took his hand easily now. No hesitation. Their fingers lacing like they belong that way. "I want to show you something," he said. She raised an eyebrow, more stone, less stone, more foolishness that made her smile. The corners of her mouth curling upward like they just remembered how he led her. Down a short path past the shed, now reinforced with fresh panels, and up toward the higher ridge overlooking the valley. The snow was softer here, half melted in places by sunlight and solar panels. They stepped carefully, but not cautiously, she trusted. The ground now and him. When they reached the rise, he stopped. At first she didn't see it. Then she did. A tiny table, 2 uneven chairs, and a slab of polished stone carved flat with 2 cups sitting at top, at a picnic. Her breath caught. Herman scratched the back of his neck. "I found some old fruit packs in the trade bin, managed to barter for them with a carved medallion. It's not much, but it's..." Everything she said. They sat together, shoulders brushing, fingers still entwined as they ate the food, was average. But the quiet joy that sat between them, that was rare at one point. Saria leaned her head against his arm, and he turned slightly toward her. She tilted her chin up, expectant, button, hurried her eyes pale and endless, held his completely. "Say it," she whispered. He blinked. What you've been carrying. I hear it in your breath." "Sometimes." He hesitated, then gave it voice. "I never thought I could be close to anyone again. I thought I'd ruin it like before, like always." "You haven't," she said simply. "You've built something with you, with me." She brought her other hand up to his jaw and brushed the side of his face with her thumb. His skin was rough, warm from the sun, and dusted with the faintest sheen of clay. She smiled faintly. "You always smell like stone." "Is that good?" "It is now." Then she leaned in. Their lips met, soft at first, then deeper. There was no hunger in it, no fear, just warmth. Familiar claimed. Her hands moved slowly to his collar, and he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, holding her as if the wind might remember to return and try to take her again, but it didn't, and she didn't pull away when they parted. Their foreheads touched, breath to breath. She let out a small laugh, breathy and surprised, that she whispered, "Felt like home." He kissed her, again, lighter this time. "You are," he said later. As the light began to bend toward dusk, they carved their initials, his in simple block letters, hers in fluid curves, into the edge of the table. Not for show, not for proof, just to say we were here and when. The first stars blinked open above the snow-wrapped cliffs. Herman pulled the blanket around them both, and Saria laid her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak again that night, They didn't need to. Some stories ended insolence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because at last nothing needed to be said.